Hello, everybody.
Hi, how are y'all?
Thanks for being here.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for coming out. We thought we'd begin with each of us giving you an overview of our development as writers and our approach to our work. As far as myself, I'm born and raised in Meridian, Mississippi, not that far from here. And as a child, I was a voracious reader. And unfortunately, Meridian didn't have a bookstore for much of my childhood, which was a big problem when trying to get a fix for my addiction to reading. And so what I would do on weekends, my father and I would go into Jackson, Mississippi, which has a wonderful bookstore named Lemuria. And on Saturdays, we go in there, and back in those days, Lemuria is on the second floor of this building, and on the first floor, there was a sports bar. And so my father would give me a $20 bill, send me upstairs to pick out a book while he watched the game and had a couple of scotches. And I would put down stakes in that store. I'd spend hours there trying to find the perfect book. And so I like to say that I have two things to thank for my development as a writer: Lemuria books and Johnny Walker Black. And so after Mississippi, I went off to college and grad school where I studied creative writing and fiction. And it was in grad school that I first came up with the idea of writing a novel about Robert Johnson. I don't know how much of his life y'all know about, but he's most famous for having sold his soul to the devil in exchange for his skills on the guitar. Story goes, perhaps apocryphal, that back in the 60s, someone played Keith Richards, a recording of Johnson, and it was just Johnson singing and playing the guitar. And so Keith listens to it for a few minutes and finally goes, yeah, that's pretty good, but who's the other guy playing? He was so good that he could make the sound of two guitars with one. And so I always wanted to write a novel about him, but I didn't have a way in. It just seemed too easy to write a typical biopic novel. And then I was watching the History Channel or some channel like that, and someone theorized that perhaps we don't know much about his life because he might have gone by different names throughout the South and even had different families, which means he would have had different wives. And so I struck on the idea of what if I wrote a novel in first person plural? That means we instead of I, from the voice of his 6 fictional wives. And I chose 6 for 2 reasons. It's the number of strings on a guitar, and it's the number most often associated with the devil. And so I came on that idea, and then I set about writing the novel. And it's the very fact that these wives are a we is really the crux of the novel in a way, because the fact that they're we means he cheated on each and every one of them with the other one. And even if you think of the story behind the title, Play Pretty Blues, play pretty is his term that he calls them when he can't remember which one he's talking to. So what was a term of endearment becomes a term of alienation. And I remember So I wrote the book, and then it was time to try and sell it, and I entered it into a contest for a small press. And I was waking up pretty early in those days, and I checked my email at 4 a.m. that morning and saw that it had won the award and would be published. And so I was so excited that I immediately called my mom. She didn't pick up, so I called my dad. And the first thing he says is, "What are you in jail for now?" And so that's how the publication of it came about. And because it was with a small press, they did a wonderful job with the book. I was so happy with them. They were so enthusiastic about it. But small presses don't have the means that a larger publisher has. And so I sort of had to organize my own book tour and pay my own way, pay for the gas, hotel rooms, etc. And one night I was staying over at my parents' place in Meridian, and the next day I had a reading and signing at this great bookstore in Greenwood, Mississippi, Turnrow Books. And I told my father, and he's like, "Oh, I've been wanting to go to Greenwood again. Can I come? And I was like, oh, bringing a parent, it kind of feels like I have a chaperone with me. I don't know. And then he goes, well, I'll spring for the hotel room. And I immediately respond, it'll be an honor for you to come with me. And on our way there, we're driving up, and I was telling him how at each reading, I like to start off with an anecdote that somehow relates to the town or area that I'm giving the reading in. And so I told him how his father, my grandfather, grew up in Greenwood. And back in those days, the newspaper had a contest whereby whoever brought in the first bloomed cotton ball of the season won a year subscription to the newspaper. And my grandfather won that contest every year. And people just thought he had a keen eye that he could spot that little white ball out in the field of green. What they didn't know was that he had built a hothouse in his backyard in which he would grow a cotton plant a few months before most of them were cultivated. So I told my father that story, and he goes, that's funny, but it's not true. And I said, what are you talking about? You told me that story. And he said, I told you the story that he won every year, but he didn't cheat. And I slowly realized that my subconscious had fictionalized the truth. It had taken this actual story and made it not only more interesting, but in a way more believable by adding a lie to it. And it's very similar to my take on Robert Johnson. And my version of his story, he didn't invent the story of the crossroads, but he didn't deny it either. He used it as a means to increase his popularity and his fame with that intrigue of his having sold soul to the devil. And so with that book, it's fairly limited. It took place over 10 years in the 1920s, mostly in Mississippi. And so with my second novel, I wanted to do something bigger. I wanted it to be a bigger performance in a way. And I had the idea of writing a book about soft drinks because colas are the Southern beverage. Southerners love soda. The epigraph to the book is actually a line from Nancy Lemon. I believe she's a Louisiana author, but the line is, Southerners need carbonation. And so I had the idea, and it began with a hypothetical question. What would a novel about the Kennedys be like if they made their fortune by inventing Coca-Cola? And so the book follows this family named Forrester, and they are from Batesville, Mississippi, which is in Panola County. So their soft drink company is called Panola Cola. And I knew that the way I wanted to structure the novel, I would need to know the entire life stories of all these characters in this family. This is a multi-generational saga that takes place over 100 years. And I knew that before I wrote the first sentence, I would need to know these characters intimately. And of course, after waking up in a cold sweat, worried that I'd never be able to pull that off, I recalled my multiplication tables. Back in second grade, I came up with this mnemonic device whereby I gave every number between 0 and 12 a personality and a place within a larger family. So 10 was the father, 5 was the mother, 9 was the oldest son, 8 his younger brother, 6 and 7 were fraternal twins, 11 and 12 were the grandparents. And when these numbers would multiply, this story, an anecdote, would play out in my head for whatever multiplication was going on, and it somehow looked like the product. And even to this day, when I factor a tip at a restaurant, these stories play out in my head. And some of these anecdotes are fairly sordid for a 12-year-old to think of. It was like this little soap opera playing out in my head for years. And I realized all I had to do was transplant these numbers into the novel. And not only would I have my characters, but I would have much of the plot. And so that's what I did. It was, instead of paint by numbers, it was write by numbers. And one of the advantages that allowed me was to make the book nonlinear. I borrowed the idea from this wonderful novel called The Known World by Edward P. Jones. It's a brilliant novel, won the Pulitzer, you should check it out. And he jumps around in time there. He's not beholden to chronology. And I really thought long and hard on why I wanted to do that. And if you think about it, chronology in any novel is artifice. Writers are always either dilating time, taking one tiny moment and expanding it to 20 pages, or they're condensing time, spanning 10 years within one page. And so what I tried to do with American Pop was lean in to the artifice of chronology in order to, I hope, make it more artful. And so that's why the book's structured that way, and then you get in the juxtapositions, the friction. That's where the heart of the book lies, and that's where the conflict lies as well. And so when I finished that, it involved a lot of research, did that, and then it was time to move on to the next book, the book I'm currently working on. And I was fortunate in that my editor of American Pop, I love working with her so much that I'm able to work with her again. She bought the novel on a partial, which enabled me to quit my day job and write full time. And so that's what I did. And both when I was writing that book and when I was writing Play Pretty Blues, when I first started, I had a system in which I would wake up at 4 a.m. in the morning, write for an hour, and then go for a long run along the Hudson River. I was living in New York City at the time. And I realized pretty quickly that the novel I was writing then, American Pop, it would take me 5-7 years to finish it if I was going at this rate. And around that time, sadly, my grandfather passed away. And so I decided to honor his memory and his generosity by using the small inheritance he left me to leave my day job, leave New York, and move back to my home state, which was also his home state. And so I moved to Oxford, Mississippi, which is a very literary town. You can't throw a rock without knocking some ironic hatware off a writer. And I lived in Oxford writing American Pop, but I would also drive down 2 hours to, my family has a farm in Yazoo County where I now live. And on this farm was this old shotgun cottage that we called the camp house. And do y'all know what a shotgun cottage is? It's so called because you can fire a shotgun from one end to the other and not hit a door. And so this is not a fancy place. This is very rustic. And my father bought it when he was a young man. He was still in law school. And he paid, I think, $800 for it and had it shipped on the back of a truck and moved out to this hilltop on the farm. But he was so proud of it. It was his first major purchase as a young man. It was his first home. So he immediately got in his car, drove 20 miles down the road to Yazoo City to pick up his mother. And he pulls up and says, "Mama, get in the car. I got something to show you." And the thing to know about my grandmother is that she's this old school Mississippi blue blood. She had since lost all her wealth, but she still had that bearing about her. And so he pulls up in front of the camp house, opens the door for her. He says, "Look at this, Mom. This is mine. I own this. Can you believe it?" And she looks at the house, takes a long drag of her cigarette, and goes, "Charles, in our family, we burn houses nicer than this." And that story really put me in mind of the fluid nature of wealth and class in America, which is a major theme of American Pop, and it's something I tried to explore in it. And it was also helpful that I lived in that camp house for much of the time I was writing the novel, and I would be inspired by all these reminders of my own family lore, which found their way into the book. The book is not autobiographical in any way, but I tried to spice it with anecdotes from my own family's life that only my family would catch. For example, there's one bit, my mother, when I was growing up, she would make this blackberry cobbler that my father loved. And so he'd ask her, "Can you do that cobbler again tonight?" And she was like, "Oh, it's so hard to make, honey, but I mean, I guess." And before he'll get home, she would like throw flour on her face and get all frazzled looking. It's like, "Oh, I spent all day on that blackberry cobbler." A couple of years later, he's looking in her copy of Southern Sideboards, the cookbook, and he sees marked this recipe called Easy Berry Cobbler. And so that made its way into the book, among other bits of family lore. And so that's how American Pop is probably my most personal book, even though it's very much fictional. And with my next novel, it's not personal in that sense, but it still concerns the American South. How many of you have heard of the Confederados? They're a real group of people. After the Civil War, somewhere between 5,000 and 20,000 Southerners expatriated to Brazil, where they had cheap farmland, tax subsidies, and where slavery was still legal. And so the book I'm working on now is about a group of those people, a colony there. And it's really a fascinating subject to explore. And so the book is due in August, so I got to get working on it. And but I like to call it, it's a book about the American South set in South America. And so that's what I'm working on now. And hopefully I'll get down there. They even say that there are pockets of people in Brazil who speak Portuguese with a Southern accent. and they love fried chicken and coleslaw. So hopefully it turns out as well as I hope it does. But Lauren, I'd like to hear from you about your career.
Yeah. The first thing I need to say about being here is I've spent many years out there at Southern Voices, several years as just a reader and a lover of stories. So to find myself up here on the stage is pretty crazy, and it's really exciting. As an author in Birmingham, I get to visit with a lot of book clubs, and which I really love. And there's one book club in particular that I've met with 3 times. After each of my 3 books, they've asked me to come. I knew you were going to be down here. And I ran into a couple of members from that book club a couple years ago, and they said, I saw them up here, and they said, "We stuffed the box with your name so that they would ask you to come speak." So thank you very much. I think they listened to you. So one of the questions I get asked a lot when I speak to groups is when I became a writer, if I've always been a writer, if I always knew I wanted to be a writer, and it's kind of a complicated answer because I didn't start writing fiction until towards the end of college, first few years after college, but I started writing a lot earlier. And I brought a visual aid to show you where I started my writing. And I only found this. This says diary on the top. I found this because my parents just moved out of their house that they lived in for my whole childhood. And I found this in my closet, and I had been telling book clubs about this the whole time I'd been meeting with people. And all I could remember was that it had a blue cover. And the first entry is December 30th, 1988. So I was 9, which is just a little bit younger than my oldest daughter now. And this little journal turned into me writing through middle school, through high school, into college, after college, my adult years. That became sort of a touchstone for me as a way to figure out what I thought about the world and my place in it, and things that I hoped for myself, and fears and loves and boys, and what I thought about marriage and what I wanted to do with myself. And I credit that process of writing early, even though I wasn't writing fiction stories, I was writing my own story, which is pretty much, I'm still doing that through my books now. I'm just using other characters' stories. I'm still processing the world and what I think about things just through characters instead of putting my own story down on the page. But that process of writing my own thoughts down, plus being a voracious reader, which I think most writers are, that's what I really think that's what put me here as an author. The very first time I came here, so I started coming in 2013 when I was writing the Hideaway. I started coming to Southern Voices. But I came a long time ago. I think it was 2002 when Pat Conroy was here. And I went up afterwards and talked to him, and I just tried not to gush too much, just about how much I loved his books and books in general. But the crazy thing was I didn't say anything about writing, because at that point it was not on my radar at all. I didn't know, and at that point there were still two camps of people in my mind. There were the people who read books and enjoyed books, and I was firmly over here in this camp. And then there were the people over here who wrote the books, and they were just somehow extra blessed, extra special, extra cool, shiny people. And it took a long time for me to realize that you can be in both camps. And it wasn't until, so in college, I started at Birmingham Southern, and then I transferred to Auburn, which sometimes gets me some cheers and sometimes gets some sort of grumbles, this is probably a mixed audience. So I spent a lot of time on the interstate between Mobile and Birmingham, and then Mobile and Auburn. And on a lot of those, and then back to Birmingham. I came back here to work after college at Southern Progress, and in a lot of those car rides, I would turn the radio off and just sort of let my brain unspool in these daydreams, and I think it was the beginnings of me trying to put stories together in my head. I'd had this whole lifetime of honing my writing, and then a lifetime of reading, but I hadn't yet started writing my own stories. And I think this was the very beginning of me trying to put together stories that were really interesting to me. And they kept me awake for 4 hours in the car. And sometimes I would get home and kind of write some of them down, and other times they would just sort of disappear. But it wasn't until 2011, I had a 2-year-old. I don't know why I decided having a 2-year-old was the perfect time to write an actual manuscript, but I wrote my first book in 2011. It was right, for those of you who live here in Birmingham, it was right after that big string of tornadoes came through Birmingham and north of Birmingham, and it sparked this idea. Ideas come from all different kinds of places, and this came from this set of tornadoes, and I had what I thought was a great book, and I wrote it really fast, in like 5 or 6 months, and I thought it was I thought it was great. I thought this was going to be my big splash into the publishing world, and I sent it to 2 friends who were good readers and who I knew were writers, and I expected, some pats on the back and some, how did you do this, even though you have young children, and instead I got back exactly what I asked them, which was feedback, and it was just covered in red ink, and here's all the things you need to change. And I realized that even though I knew what made a satisfying story for me, and I thought I had a talent for writing, that didn't translate to me knowing how to get all of my ideas out of my head and onto the page in a really coherent way. So I spent some time reading some really good fiction, really strong fiction, and I read all the books on craft of writing. I read Anne Lamott and Stephen King's book about writing, and I just tried to soak in the wisdom that I could from these writers. And a couple years later, I got the idea of this woman with a bird's nest hat in a really tumble-down old house. And I had always wanted, I was kind of wanting to set a story in the Mobile Bay area. I'm from Mobile, and I kind of felt like Mobile was underrepresented in the world of Southern fiction. We've got a lot of South Carolina, low country stuff. There's a lot of Mississippi, but Mobile was just sort of left out. So I thought, okay, I could set a story there. This is where I would want to set my mind for the year or however long it took me to write this book. And then I'd always loved New Orleans. Growing up in Mobile, we took a lot of day trips to New Orleans, and so I thought I had this woman, and her name just popped in my head, Mags. And I didn't even know it was Maggie, which had been shortened from Margaret, but it was just Mags with the hat and this house. And I started playing around with ideas. And I had the older woman and the younger woman. I made it a granddaughter and a grandmother, and I started kind of brainstorming and outlining who I thought these people could be and what the story could be. And I consider myself a pretty average reader, and I was getting really interested and invested in the story. And I thought, well, maybe if I'm this interested, maybe there will be other people who are interested too. So I decided to write it. The first draft took me about 10 months, and during that time I joined a writer's group, and we actually met here for a little while at the library upstairs. Once a week, we exchanged a chapter a week of all of our work, and we critiqued it, and I really credit that group their friendship, but also writing groups can be a lot like therapy, which is really wonderful. But they also just gave me the validation. They weren't my husband and they weren't my mom, so they didn't have to like what I was writing, but they did, and they really helped me keep going in this story. And I finished the story, I edited and did all the revising, and decided it was time to start looking for an agent. So I made a spreadsheet of all the agents I wanted to query. You send a query letter to agents to try to get them basically to take you on as a client, kind of like a real estate agent, but you don't, well, not really, kind of like a real estate agent. But so I started sending these letters out, and I had done it for about 3 or 4 months. And I didn't know what I was doing. And I didn't know how long I was supposed to keep querying when I hadn't had an agent bite and say, yes, I'll represent your work. So I started sending some emails out to authors who I thought wouldn't think I was crazy for sending them a random email, asking them I was just trying to get whatever advice and encouragement I could get. And one of the people I contacted was Patty Henry here in Birmingham. And I really had no ulterior motive. I just wanted to talk to some people who knew about this business, because I just felt like I've got this book and I really like it and I think people would like it, but I don't even know how to get it out there. And so she met me for coffee and she asked about the book, and I told her about it, and she said, I have this editor friend who I think might be interested in your story. Do you mind if I connect you? And I said, that'd be great. Go ahead and make that connection. So she sent an email to both of us, and this editor's name was Amy, and Amy said, go ahead and send me your manuscript. It sounds really interesting. So I sent it off, and then I sent my husband and my mom a text and said, don't get too excited, but this is kind of a big deal. And I just kind of held my breath and hit send, and then I never heard from her again. I had built it up, and then I never heard anything. And it turned out that she left the publisher, went to a different publisher, and I found that out, and I just thought, well, she either read it and didn't love it, or it just got lost in the shuffle, and that's that. So I kept sending out letter after letter, and was talking to different agents. And in, March or April of that year, we're in 2015 now, I got an email from another editor at that same publisher. Thomas Nelson is the publisher. This girl's name was Carly, and she said, Amy sent me your manuscript before she left the company, because she liked it and she wanted to get another set of eyes on it. So do you have an agent? Have you already published? What's your situation? And I said, I don't have an agent, but I'm working on it. This is great. Let me know how I can help you. Let me know if you need anything. So I sent my mom and my husband a text and said, don't get too excited, but this is a big deal. And Carly emailed me back the next week and said, we're about to be discussing your book in our acquisitions meeting. Do you have an agent yet? And this was 1 week later. I said, no, I don't have an agent, but I'm working on it. Let me know how it goes. So I went home and I Googled acquisitions meeting, because I had a feeling that it was a big deal, but I didn't really know what it really meant. And thankfully, another agent had written a very helpful blog post where he outlined exactly what hoops your book has to go through before a publisher will offer a contract. And I found out that the acquisitions meeting was way down here, and you still had a lot of hoops to go through, but it was still a big deal. There was somebody from editorial and marketing and publicity, and all sitting around talking about the lady with the bird's nest hat, and Alan and Crawford and Sarah and all these people I had concocted during my kids' nap times. So she emailed me back and said, you got all green lights. Now we're going on to the next level. And to make a long story short, she kept saying, they're just giving you thumbs up. This, it's just moving through the process. So I had my imagination was this big ladder, and this little book was just kind of climbing the ladder. And one of the last hoops, I guess, was the sales team. And Carly said, I'll be real honest with you, this is where debut authors' stories kind of tend to go to die, because it's really hard to get a publisher and a sales team to agree to put forth the money to push a new debut author out into the world. So I, prepared myself for everything to fall through, and she emailed me back and said, you got all green lights. So one thing led to another, and that summer we had a conference call that felt a little like a second or third date, where you kind of see, do we really like each other? We're going to hop on the phone and see if we, our personalities mesh. And there were several people on the phone call, including the publisher, which was a woman named Daisy. And I really loved all they had to say about where they saw my books fitting into their world of publishing, and they liked my story ideas. And a couple months later, my agent called me. I did find an agent. Oh, I didn't even say that. So I found an agent. I discovered once I put publisher interest in the subject line, that really roped him in quickly. And I found an agent who, so you're all real readers, so you probably read all the words in a book. And in the back, there's usually an acknowledgement section. And a lot of authors will thank their agent. So I kind of short-circuited the process and started looking up Thomas Nelson authors to see who their agents were. I thought maybe if I find somebody who already had experience with this publisher, that would help. And it did. I mean, I don't think that's why I think she really just loved my story, but she had represented some other Thomas Nelson agents. Thomas Nelson authors. So my agent called me. Her name's Karen, and I was sitting on the floor of my kitchen putting my kids' shoes on to get ready to go to meet the teacher. It was in August, and she said, Thomas Nelson has offered you a 2-book contract for The Hideaway and whatever you're going to write next, which I had already started on because they in publishing tell you when you're querying for one book, go ahead and start writing the next book. So I think it's so you'll have something to focus on so you don't go crazy trying to wait for the email or wait for the phone call. But also it shows them you're not a one-trick pony, that you've got other books coming. So The Hideaway came out in 2017. Hurricane Season was my second. It's the story that she mentioned about marriage and family and motherhood, and it's set on a dairy farm in South Alabama. And then my third book, Glory Road, came out last spring, and it's set on a red dirt road similar to where my grandparents lived during my whole childhood. The settings usually come first for me when I'm writing, and I knew I wanted to go back to my grandparents' house. Was just my favorite place to be, and it was this tiny little town called Sims, north of Mobile. I changed the name and kind of made it a fictional town, but I kind of choose my locations based on where I want to set my mind for the next however long it takes me to write a book. And right now I'm in the middle of a 3-book contract, and so that makes my 4th book come out in June of this year. It's called The Summer House, and I'm currently working on my next one, which is set right in Mobile. I feel like I've sort of been dancing around Mobile for a long time, and I'm finally setting a book right in the little area where I grew up. And the last thing I'll say is I just finished reading this book by this guy named Andrew Peterson, who he's a Christian musician, songwriter, but he's written this great book about the process of writing. And he wrote about how when he is sitting up on stage, probably not like this because this is so dark I can't see you, but when he's up on stage singing to a group of people, he can tell which people are kind of not really into his song. They're checking their phone or they're talking to the person next to him, but there's always some people who are really locked into what he's singing and what he's talking about. And I feel like at this point in my writing journey or career or whatever you call it, I know that I can't please everybody with every book that I write, but my hope is that there's some people who feel the way my favorite books make me feel, which is to feel like they've been able to capture something on the page that I've never really been able to put into words, but I feel, and when I read it, I know it, and it feels like somebody's kind of seen you in a way, and somebody's kind of acknowledged you. And I feel like if I can do that for any other, even just a few readers, then that makes this whole like staying up at night and wondering if you can finish this book and wondering if anybody's going to buy it and all the things that go through a writer's mind and author's mind. It makes it all worth it to know that there are some people who are really, who really feel kind of met in the reading experience. So that's my story, and we can take questions from y'all, and we can ask each other some questions too. I would love to know. You talked about your multiplication process and how you. That's a very interesting way to come up with your characters and your plot. But tell me a little bit about how detailed your outlines are. Your book covers 100 years, so there's a lot more involved in keeping things straight. How do you do that?
With my first book, because it was about a real person, I had the structure right there in front of me because of his biography. A guy is born, does stuff, and dies. It's right there. I just fill in the gaps. But with American Pop, the structure came with. It was more of exploring this family and the ins and outs of their lives. I considered it a literary soap opera, and so I would wake up every morning excited to find out what would happen to the Forsters today, and that was really a rare thing, I think, for a lot of writers. And I would just. I think someone described plot as you get your character into a tree, throw rocks at them, and then get them out of the tree. And so that's what I would do. I would get my characters into trees, throw a lot of rocks at them, and then eventually get them out of that tree. And so that allowed for the structure and the content, the plot of the book. As far as and what I used in American Pop as a through line, a MacGuffin, is the idea of the mystery, the secret ingredient for this soda. And so I use it similarly to the way Rosebud is used in Citizen Kane. And at the very end of the book, I do give the reader what that ingredient is. I would never be so cruel as to hold that back from them. But that's how I structured it, and that's how I plotted it. But when it comes to endings, I don't like to know where the book is going to end or how it's going to end. I had a novel that I wrote in grad school, which was a novelization of this screenplay I had written, and it won a couple of awards. So I was like, okay, well, people like this. I can just make this into a book. Fine. But because of that, I knew everything that was going to happen and how it would end, and it was just dead on arrival. Because I wasn't surprised by anything in it, I couldn't expect the reader to be surprised. And so now I try to keep myself from knowing the ending of a novel before I get there. I say that, but I'm working on a book now, and when I was about a third of the way into it, I was like thinking, oh, what if it ended that way? Oh, damn it, that's good. Okay, yeah, that's how it's got to end. So that's how that worked. How about yourself? How do you structure? How do you plot out?
I don't outline very detailed. I sort of I need to know the ending. I do need to know, at least have a sense of the ending from the get-go, or I will wander too much. But I like what you said about if you're not surprised by the ending, the readers might not be surprised. I have an idea of where I want it to go, but it often doesn't look exactly like it did when I first started. It kind of has the same feel, or the certain people are together or whatever happens. I knew that bit, but the way you get there is usually pretty different than how I originally envision it. But I do from the beginning, I just sort of write longhand in a notebook. I just write who I think the characters are and where the plot could go and kind of what the main ideas of the story are. And then I start writing, and I usually don't get too far before I start writing out the next few chapters. I'll say, where I am right now in this current book I'm writing, I've got at the end of the manuscript all this stuff in red of okay, this is what's going to happen here, and then in the next chapter it's this. And it helps me stay focused, but it also keeps me from having to stare at a blank, totally blank page every morning. I kind of have an idea of where I'm going, so it takes a little bit of that fear away. But I think for me, having the ending point, there's still a lot of wiggling that can happen in between there. I just know where I'm going when I get to the end.
I think it was E.O. Doctorow who said that he plots as though you're in a car driving at night, and he can see just as far as the headlights go.
Yeah.
But
I think about that a lot.
Yeah. I think that's helpful. On another note, I was wondering, what do you typically start with in your novels? A character, a situation, an idea, a voice?
I usually what the first nugget of the idea is the setting, usually where I'm going to place the story. But actually, writing down the first sentences are so hard for me because I never know where to start the story, and I usually end up discovering later, chapters and chapters in, that I didn't start in the right place. And I I have to kind of fight the urge to go back and fix everything, because I've realized this about myself. I will keep going back to the beginning and fixing the beginning rather than going forward. So a lot of times if I've realized I started this in the wrong place, I'll just kind of go back and make a note, knowing like I need to start here where the action really starts. That was one of the first things my agent said to me was, you need to make sure you start your action or start your story right before the thing, whatever the thing is that starts everything happening. Start right then. I kind of tend to start back here and then slowly meander my way there. So I'm learning to kind of jump in a little quicker. Sometimes when I'm reading stories and it starts off immediately with a bang or immediately in the middle of a conversation, I think I don't know, I can feel a little off kilter sometimes. I feel like I need a little bit in there to just kind of acclimate me to what's going on before we really jump in with major action. So I try not to do too much throat clearing at the beginning, but there's a little bit just to kind of ease people in. Right. What about you? Do you start with dialogue, or what do you start? How do you do that?
It depends on the book.
Yeah.
So, for example, with the Robert Johnson book, I thought it began with, what if I wrote a book about Robert Johnson? And so that led to researching his life. And then when I came up with the narrator and the voice of that narrator, that was the way into the book. With American Pop, it was that hypothetical question: what would a novel about the Kennedys be like if they had made their fortune by inventing Coca-Cola? And I knew I wanted to write something epic in scope. And then with this book I'm writing now, my first two novels, I suppose, will be considered, the genre will be considered literary fiction, which I'm not too keen on these genre distinctions. I mean, it's saying something is literary or not literary is more qualitative, whereas a genre that's more quantitative. If a mystery book has a murder, a cop, things like that, whereas literary, there's no defining rubric for it. It's just if you use fancy words and it's boring.
And it's boring.
Then it's considered literary. But so with the book I'm writing now, I had the idea of writing about these Confederados. It just seemed so fascinating to me. But I also wanted to write a real page turner, something that moves, that has plot. Because in grad school and in teaching students and also reading a lot of debut literary novels, I'm always struck by how slow and dull a lot of them are. I'm not going to name any names here, but just nothing happens. And so I always want books where stuff happens. And that's what I tell my students. I would say, just tell a story. Tell me a story. Entertain me. Yeah. And so with this novel, because it's taking place right after the Civil War, I consider it a Western. What created what we think of as the Old West? It was the Civil War, which trained people to kill and numb them to violence, and then sent them off to a frontier. So here you have this group of people. It might not be the American West, but they're on a frontier. And so I'm utilizing various tropes of Western novels. You have the gunslinger, you have the hooker with a heart of gold, you have the whiskey priest. And I'm also trying to tweak them. I don't want it to be just a stereotypical or cliched use of these tropes of the Western genre. And that's the other thing. I not that long ago found out that I love reading Westerns. Growing up, my dad would make me watch John Wayne movies, and I found them so boring. But then I discovered this book by Ron Hansen called The Assassination of Jesse James by the Coward Robert Ford. And it took the top of my head off. I loved it. And so then I just started reading every Western I could find. Elmer Leonard is a favorite novelist of mine, and he's mostly known for his crime fiction, but before that, he wrote a whole slew of Western books. And so it's been a lot of fun to use those genre elements and still bring in the more literary, high-minded aspects that I'm used to and love. And so blending the high and low is something I've always enjoyed doing in fiction, and making a book entertaining. That's just my first and foremost my goal.
Yeah. 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 You want to ask them some questions?
Does anybody have any questions for us?
it is kind of hard to see. I can't see anything.
You mentioned, he mentioned he was able to quit his day job. I'm just curious, on average, and you don't have to give me exact figures, but how much money do you make off?
$1 billion.
$1 billion. We're very rich. We make a lot of money. We can kind of say how it works. I mean,
Sure.
If you have a traditional publisher, basically the publisher makes a lot more money than the writers do. I'll say that. I mean, you get an advance of a certain amount of money, and once you earn that much of sales, then you start earning royalties, a percentage of your sales.
And the way advances work is you get X amount of money. Let's just, for the roundness of the number, say $100,000. Once you get that contract, your agent takes 15% right off the top. And that's standard. That's the standard rate for all agents.
Yeah.
And then you have to think about taxes you have to pay on it. But you're not getting that $100,000 in one lump sum. It's going to be in either 3 or 4 payments. So you'll get a third up front, a third when the book is finally finished, and a third when it's published. There might even be a 4th installment if they wait for the paperback to give that chunk there. So if you get a $100,000 advance, it sounds wonderful. You think, oh, I'm rich now. But you might not be able to live on it because you're not getting that all up front, and it's being depleted by an agent's cut and the government's cut. So it can be hard to be a full-time writer, and that's why I think a lot of writers have day jobs, most often as teachers, and that could be very fulfilling. I've taught in the past, and being able to, while teaching students how to write, I often teach myself how to write. I learn things that I think work in fiction and things that I think don't work, and so it makes me a better writer to be a teacher.
Yeah.
Do you have to have an agent?
You do not have to have an agent. Most publishers, from what I understand, most editors don't want to really talk to you if they don't want you to approach them without an agent. They would rather deal with an agent rather than just a random person submitting their material. I was a little bit different in the fact that I didn't have an agent when I had my first contact with an editor. And when Patty said, "Do you mind if I connect you with the editor?" in the back of my head, I was hearing all of this advice that had said, never approach an editor without an agent. But I figured it was okay because this author who knew what she was doing was telling me it was okay. And it ended up being that way. But usually the process is you find an agent, and then that agent finds you a publisher. Has that been, I didn't even hear you mention if you worked with an agent or...
For my first book, when it was out for submission, I did have an agent, but he wasn't able to place it. And so then I started submitting it to small press contests on my own. And so when it won one, I could have involved him, but because he didn't do anything and it was a $1,000 advance, why would I give him 15% of that for not having done any work? But yeah, agents really are helpful, though. Legally speaking, they help you with the contract, and so you could be in the lurch if you don't have an agent to review that sort of thing. So with my second novel, I knew I wanted an agent, and I don't know, are there any aspiring writers out there who might be looking for agents at some point? If there are, just to give you a little bit of hope. I was querying agents over and over again, and guess how many turned me down before one finally took on the book?
I love hearing this number.
156.
Whoa. Yeah.
So if you're in that situation where you keep getting turned down, my advice for you is to be persistent.
Going,
if you believe in your work, keep being persistent, and you'll find your champion, and that's all you need.
Yeah, that's great.
Yes. Several publications periodically pose questions to like a contest to their readers. And I've seen this one on occasion, for them to write the worst first opening of a book. If you were told to write the worst one, what would you write?
A bad opening to our own book or to any oh my. Oh gosh. Oh, I have no idea. I mean, there's all the rules of,
Once upon a time, or was it dark and stormy?
yeah, or they tell you not to start a book with a character waking up, and or not to have a character looking in the mirror to see what they look like. But I mean, everybody breaks the rules all the time. I don't know. I can't really think on my feet like that to come up with a really bad opening.
What's
Do
the
you have
opening
one?
of 50 Shades of Grey?
That would be the winner. Although that was a very successful book, I hear.
Yeah, well, there you go. Shows what I know.
Maybe it's not so bad.
How much control do you have over your finished product, whether it be audiobook or a regular traditional hard?
Go ahead.
I don't know how all publishers are, but I have felt so lucky the whole way through with this publisher because they've actually given me way more control than I thought. I had heard authors talk about getting these, 10 and 15-page editors' letters with all these edits, and I was so scared of that because I thought, how does it still feel like your work after somebody else has gone in and changed everything? And that has not been my experience at all. I've had, for all three of my, four now, the fourth being the one that's coming out this year, I had one editor for my first two, and then I had another editor for my last two, and both of them were so perceptive and such great readers that they basically just, the only changes we really made was where they could tell what was in my head wasn't actually translating to the page, and usually it had to do with character motivation, making sure that you understand why a character is doing something, and making sure those connections are clear. But I've never had to change an ending. I've never had to, take characters out, the story that you read is 98% what I gave them. But it's a lot better because it's been tightened and there's not missing connections that have gotten cluttered between my brain and yours. And as far as, I've had a lot of input on covers, which I'm not sure is really normal. They submit the covers to me and to see what I think, and I'm able to say, I like this, I don't like this. So I've been really pleased with the amount of input I've had and that control. Because for me, if it felt like it wasn't my story anymore, I don't think I would want to do it because I don't want it to feel like a collaborative thing. I want it to be my book. What about you? Have you felt?
I've
like
been
you've had
fortunate
control?
to have a very good relationship with my editor,
Good.
and that began when the book was out on submission. And so the way it works is, if you're lucky, you'll get multiple editors interested in the book, and if you live in New York, they'll want a face-to-face meeting, but if you don't, then you have a phone call. And so I talked to a few editors for an hour on the phone, and they told me what they liked about the book, what they thought could use some work, and I got a sense of their sense of the book, and also I got a sense of our relationship, how we would work. And then based on that, I went with the editor that I felt most comfortable with and whose edits I agreed with. And so she's also the editor of my forthcoming book, and I really love the idea of an editor and writer having parallel careers, sort of like Matt Perkins and Scott Fitzgerald. I like the idea of just having a lifelong relationship. And so with her, she always has very insightful edits, but a writer shouldn't take every single note they get. Yeah. If you're doing that, you're doing something wrong, because no editor is going to be right 100% of the time. I always tell people, or I think, and personally, a good breakdown of it will be, and this has just happened to apply to all my work with my editor, 50% of her edits I agree with 100% and take them. 25% of them, I'm like, I kind of like my way better, but I see your point, so I'll take that edit. And then the last 25%, I'm like, nope, my way's better. I'm keeping it the way I had it. And I think editors appreciate that. I've heard from many editors that if their author takes all of their suggestions, then something's wrong.
Mm. Sure. Anybody? It's so hard to see. Yes, ma'am.
But you mentioned Memorial and the bookstore in Jackson, Mississippi. I could not find one of independent bookstore bookstore in Atlanta. Is there one?
There is. The what?
Above 400. There's a few that are around. I'm not sure about in Atlanta proper. I'm gonna forget everything. I know there's some around. There's the Book Exchange in Marietta, and there's Foxtail in Woodstock, which is very. They work with authors a whole lot and have a lot of really great events. There's one called the Book Miser.
Acapella Books is
Acapella
in Inman
Books.
Park, and also
Yes.
Eagle Eye Indicator, I believe is his name. But Acapella was walking distance from me
Yeah.
when I lived there, and so that
Right
was
in
my
Atlanta.
go-to.
Well, yeah. Yeah, I think Atlanta's got a lot.
There's another one that used to be, I think, around 5 points that was round and
I think that might have been Acapella. It moved right down the street, so now it's technically in Inman Park, but it was in Little Five Points. Okay. Yeah.
Out of date books.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned covers of books. Why is it that sometimes you see the same cover for multiple books? Is that like different books will have the same cover, or you think,
Yeah.
I've seen that before?
Yeah, that's happened to me before. Not with my books, but I've seen, like, I know these are similar. I mean, I think that a lot of them are stock images and sometimes they manipulate, it'll take us, 4 or 5 elements from 4 or 5 different images and put them together. But my only guess is that there's several stock companies that you go and you find photos, and maybe there's one that is just really striking to everybody. And it seems like there should be some sort of database out there that you could plug it in and make sure nobody's already grabbed this one. So far, I don't think my covers have ever ended up on another book, although I did find, my mom sent me a snapshot of Garden and Gun. Several years ago, the cover of the Hideaway, this is a bed and breakfast in Louisiana. Like this cover, it's a house that's got a name, and I had no idea until it was in Garden and Gun. But it hasn't been on another cover of a book, so that's good.